Hey everyone, welcome back. You ever get that feeling like you're stuck in a rut? You have the potential to do more,
hmm
but someone's holding you back. Maybe it's just plain old laziness.
Well, you're definitely not alone. It's something we all struggle with from time to time, and that's exactly what we're diving into today.
That's right. We're taking a deep dive into a podcast episode all about conquering laziness. It's called Stop Being Lazy. You're Wasting a Lot of Time, from the Learn English podcast channel, hosted by Leo and Gwen.
And what I found really interesting about their approach is it's not just about offering quick fixes or surface level tips. They actually dig into the root causes of
It's
laziness.
like they're saying, hold on, before we jump to solutions, let's understand why we're feeling lazy in the first place.
Exactly. It's like a doctor diagnosing the problem before prescribing the medicine.
Makes sense. So
Okay.
what are some of those root causes they uncovered?
Well, one of the big ones they highlighted was lack of motivation, that feeling of what's the point? It can really drain your energy.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been there. Like when
Yeah.
you just can't see the connection between your efforts and the outcome.
Right. And then on the flip side, there's the feeling of being totally overwhelmed, like a task just seems too massive to even begin.
Ah, procrastination station populations.
Yeah.
It's funny because they actually mentioned a Stanford study about this. Apparently, large tasks make people way more likely to procrastinate.
They did. In the study, people were given the choice between doing a small task right away or tackling a bigger one later. Guess what most people
The
chose?
small task. I mean, instant gratification.
Right. Not quite. They actually chose to put off the bigger challenge. It's like that classic, I'll clean the whole house tomorrow, but tomorrow never comes.
Oh, I feel seen.
Yeah.
But okay, so how do we combat this?
Well, the podcast hosts use this great example of learning a new language. The idea of becoming fluent can feel so overwhelming, it's paralyzing.
Right, like where do you even start?
Exactly. But they suggest shifting your perspective. Instead of focusing on that huge end goal, what if you commit to just 10 minutes of practice a day?
Oh, I like that. Suddenly it feels doable.
Right. It's not about lowering your expectations, but about breaking them down into manageable chunks.
So it's all about the power of small steps.
Exactly. And this ties into another key point they made, the power of habit formation.
Habits. You mean like brushing our teeth or checking our phones first thing in the morning?
Those are definitely habits, but we're talking about harnessing the power of habits for good.
Ah,
They cited research from Duke University that found that almost 40% of our daily actions are driven by habits, not conscious decisions.
whoa, 40%. That's almost half our day on autopilot.
It is, and the implication is huge. If we can swap out bad habits for good ones, we're essentially setting ourselves up for success without having to rely on willpower alone.
So it's like creating a system that works for you even when you're not actively thinking about it.
Exactly. Remember that example of practicing a language for 10 minutes a day? Well, the podcast hosts pointed out that even starting with a tiny action like a 5-minute walk can build momentum.
Wait, so you're saying even small actions can have a big impact?
Exactly. It's about creating what they call a success spiral, where small wins fuel your motivation to keep going. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how once you start doing something, even something small, it's easier to keep going?
Hmm. Yeah, I think I get it. Like once you break that initial inertia, it's smoother sailing from there.
Precisely. But of course, there are always things that can derail us, and one of the biggest culprits is distractions.
Oh, tell me about it. I feel like I'm constantly bombarded with distractions, especially in today's world.
Right, and the podcast actually shared a statistic that blew my mind. The average person spends 3 hours a day on their phone.
3 hours. No judgment here. I'm definitely part of that statistic. But wow, that really adds up.
It does. And it's not just phones. We're constantly inundated with information and stimulation from all directions.
So how do we fight back? How do we reclaim our focus?
Well, the podcast offered a surprisingly simple but effective tip, out of sight, out of mind.
You mean like physically removing the distractions?
Exactly, like putting your phone in another room while you're working or studying.
Okay, I could see that working.
Yeah,
It's like creating a little sanctuary for your brain.
precisely. But you know what? Sometimes even when we know what to do, it can
Yeah.
still be so hard to just get started.
I hear you. It's like there's this invisible barrier between thinking about doing something and actually doing it.
And that's where the just start mentality comes in. The podcast hosts really emphasized this idea. They said that sometimes action precedes motivation.
Wait, so you're saying instead of waiting to feel motivated, we should just dive in, even if we don't feel like it?
Exactly. It might sound counterintuitive, but think about it. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you don't feel hungry until you start eating?
Hmm. Yeah, which I have.
It's the same principle. Sometimes taking action, even a small one, can spark that motivation and get you going.
So it's like tricking your brain into action.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And they also emphasize the importance of celebrating those small wins. It makes the process feel less like a chore and more sustainable.
Makes sense. Positive reinforcement always helps.
Absolutely. So we've talked about understanding the roots of laziness, breaking things down, building good habits, minimizing distractions, and embracing that just start mindset. That's a lot to digest.
It is. But it's also valuable. And I'm curious,
Yeah.
what's one thing that's really resonating with you so far?
You know what's really sticking with me is that statistic about habits. The fact that almost half of our actions are driven by habits, not conscious decisions. It makes you realize the power of those seemingly small actions we repeat day after day.
It's true. If we can be more intentional about those habits, we can create a life that's more aligned with our goals.
Exactly. It's about making those small changes that compound over time. But there's one thing I'm still grappling with, that just start mentality. Sounds great in theory, but how do we actually put it into practice?
That's a great question. And it's something we're going to explore in more depth as we continue our deep dive into conquering laziness.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How much of our lives is shaped by those little autopilot actions?
It does. But hey, at least we know it can work in our favor too. Right? Like if we're smart about building good habits.
Exactly. It's like we're setting ourselves up for success, even when we're not consciously trying.
I like that. But what about the flip side? Breaking those bad habits, that can feel like a whole other beast.
It definitely can. And it's something Leo and Gwen touched on in the podcast.
Oh, I'm all ears. Breaking bad habits is my eternal struggle.
Well, they made this interesting point. A lot of people try to change too many things at once, like
Yeah.
that classic New Year's resolution syndrome. Go big or go home, and then crash and burn a few weeks later.
Ugh, tell me about it. Why do we do that to ourselves?
I don't know. Maybe we think we can just willpower our way through anything.
Or maybe it's that all or nothing mentality.
Yeah.
If I can't do it perfectly, I might as well not do it at all.
Maybe. But the podcast hosts suggest a different approach. They recommend focusing on one small habit at a time. Master that, and then move on to the next.
Kind of like building a house brick by brick.
Exactly. You need that solid foundation before you can start adding on all the fancy stuff.
That's a great analogy. Slow and steady wins the race,
Right. And it brings to mind something we talked about earlier, fear of failure.
which can definitely hold us back. But what about fear of success? Is that even a thing?
It is. It might sound strange, but it's definitely real. And just as paralyzing as fear of failure.
I get the fear of failure part.
Yeah.
But why would anyone be afraid of succeeding? Isn't that what we all want?
Logically, yes. But success often comes with big changes and a whole lot of unknowns. People might worry about new responsibilities, higher expectations, or even losing their current relationships or sense of identity.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. It's like, be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. You achieve what you thought you wanted, but then it comes with a whole new set of challenges.
So how do we overcome that fear of success? It sounds like it can really sabotage our efforts.
Well, the podcast didn't directly address this, but I think some of the principles we've been discussing apply here too. Remember the power of breaking down large goals into smaller steps?
Right. So instead of getting overwhelmed by the big picture, you focus on the process, one step at a time.
Exactly. And that just start mentality, that applies here too. Instead of getting paralyzed by what might happen if you succeed, you take action and see where it leads.
So it's about trusting the process and trusting ourselves.
Exactly. And as you experience those small wins and gain momentum, that fear often starts to fade.
It's like the more you do, the less scary it becomes.
Right. But it's also important to acknowledge and validate your feelings. Don't try to suppress the fear or pretend it doesn't exist.
So face it head on, acknowledge it, explore it,
Right.
and then choose to move forward anyway.
You got it. It's
Yeah.
about taking back your power. But, even when we're motivated, focused, ready to tackle our goals, sometimes it feels like there's not enough hours in the day.
Don't tell me about it. My to-do list never seems to get shorter.
That's where the art of prioritization comes in.
Prioritization. That's something I definitely need to work on. Everything feels important.
Yeah.
How do you decide what to focus on first?
It's a skill. It takes practice, especially in today's world. But the key is to identify the tasks that will really move the needle and to be okay with saying no to things that aren't the best use of your time right now.
Okay. But how do you actually figure out what's truly important? Is there some magic formula?
No magic formula, but there are some helpful frameworks. One I like is the Eisenhower matrix.
The Eisenhower matrix, I've heard of that. But to be honest, I'm not really sure how it works.
It's pretty simple, actually. It's basically a grid with 4 quadrants, and you categorize tasks based on their urgency and importance. It was actually popularized by Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States. He was known for being incredibly productive.
Wow, if it worked for a president, it's definitely worth a try. So
Eh.
how does it work?
Okay, so the first quadrant is for tasks that are both urgent and important. These are the things you absolutely have to deal with right away.
Got it. So like deadlines, crises, things like that.
Exactly. The second quadrant is for tasks that are important but not urgent. These are things that contribute to your long-term goals and values, but they don't have a pressing deadline.
Okay. So things like planning for the future, learning new skills, working on personal projects.
You got it. Now, the third quadrant is for tasks that are urgent but not important. These are often distractions that pull you away from what really matters.
Ooh, I think we all have a few of those lurking in our lives.
Probably. And then finally, the fourth quadrant is for tasks that are neither urgent nor important. These are the time wasters, the things we should try to eliminate altogether.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this works. So the goal is to focus on those first 2 quadrants, the urgent and important, and the important but not urgent.
Exactly. The Eisenhower matrix helps you visualize where your time and energy are going, and it gives you a framework for making conscious choices.
I like it. It's like a roadmap for productivity.
Exactly. But sometimes even when we're doing all the right things, we still hit a wall.
Like you're just running on empty.
Exactly. And that's where self-care comes in.
Self-care. I mean, I know it's important,
Right.
but how does it tie into all of this?
Well, sometimes what we perceive as laziness is actually a sign of burnout exhaustion or even underlying mental health challenges.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's easy to just label ourselves as lazy without considering the bigger picture.
It is. And it's so important to remember that taking care of your well-being is essential for maintaining energy-focused motivation. It's like trying to run a car on an empty tank. You're not going to get very far.
So self-care is like filling up the tank.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be complicated or time-consuming. It can be as simple as getting enough sleep, eating nutritious foods, and making time for activities that bring you joy.
Like taking a walk in nature, reading a good book, spending time with loved ones.
Exactly. Things that nourish your soul. And don't underestimate the power of mindfulness and meditation. Even a few minutes a day can make a difference.
Those are great reminders. Sometimes we forget that taking care of ourselves isn't selfish. It's essential for being our best selves.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And sometimes the most productive thing you can do is give yourself permission to rest and recharge.
Like hitting the reset button, so you can come back even stronger.
Exactly. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've covered so much ground.
We have. It's amazing how much there is to learn about something as seemingly simple as laziness.
It is. But remember, the real work begins now. It's time to take all these insights and put them into action.
It's true. It's one thing to talk about it, but actually putting it all into practice, that's the real challenge.
It is. There's often a gap between what we know and what we actually do. It's like having a toolbox full of amazing tools, but never using them to build anything.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we go from passive listeners to active doers?
Well, the podcast hosts talked about this key ingredient, accountability.
Accountability. I'm listening.
It's about having someone or something that helps you stay on track with your goals. Could be a friend, a family member, a coach, even a system you set up for yourself.
Like a workout buddy or a study group.
Exactly. Having someone to share your goals with, to check in with, to celebrate wins with, it can make a world of difference.
It's like having your own personal cheerleader, someone to keep you motivated and focused.
Exactly. And it's not just about external accountability either. There's also internal accountability.
Internal accountability, what's that?
It's about developing self-awareness and self-discipline, being honest with yourself about your progress, identifying areas where you need to improve, holding yourself to a higher standard.
So basically, becoming your own coach.
Exactly. Cultivating that inner drive.
Yeah.
And it ties back to something we talked about earlier, celebrating those small wins.
Oh, yeah. Those are so important.
They are. Those small wins help you build momentum and keep that motivation going. They give you a sense of accomplishment, which fuels your desire to keep pushing forward.
It's like leveling up in a video game. It's so satisfying. And it makes you want to keep playing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So celebrate those wins, no matter how small they might seem. Acknowledge your progress. Give yourself credit for the effort you're putting in.
It's like giving yourself a pat on the back for a job well done.
Right. And remember, this journey of overcoming laziness, it's not about perfection. It's about progress, those small steps forward, the consistent effort over time.
It's about embracing the ups and downs, learning from our mistakes, and just continually trying to improve.
Exactly. So, thinking back to that question we asked earlier, if almost half of our actions are driven by habits, what's one small positive habit you could start building today to help you chip away at that laziness?
You know, after all this, I think for me it's about being more intentional with my time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, instead of just letting the day happen to me, I want to actively plan my day, prioritize my tasks, create a schedule that supports my goals, take back control.
That's fantastic. That's a perfect example of how a small shift in habits can have a big impact on your productivity and well-being.
I'm feeling inspired. This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you, and I hope our listeners are feeling empowered to tackle their own laziness and unlock their full potential.
Absolutely. And remember, this journey is ongoing. There will be setbacks, there will be challenges, but the key is to never give up on yourself. Keep experimenting, keep learning, keep growing.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of laziness and productivity. Until next time.
See you then.